Looks like we're all set. So yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone to um, Our Ladies Dallas. This is greetings from Dallas. First of all, I know that everybody's joining from all kinds of places right now, so I definitely want to make sure that everybody's um, yeah, just kind of everybody's good. I mean, definitely we can say things in the chat, I guess, if you want to greet each other. One thing that we like to do when we get started is to just um, introduce ourselves, I guess, and say where we're from. So if you'd like to just go ahead and type in the chat, maybe the location that you're dialing in from. If you just kind of say, what city you're from. Obviously, we'll have some representation in Dallas, but yeah, because of COVID, there's, you know, we've got, we usually have people joining from different countries, which is always fun. So that'll be kind of interesting to see who's here. For people who just joined, oh, I got a flurry of people. Whoa, okay. Yep, okay. Everybody just kind of came in at the same time. Sorry. Okay, sorry, and I'm easily distracted. So like I see these notifications popping up and I have to, hit them. Yeah, so people who just joined, could you just kind of let us know where you're joining us from? If you're in the US, just maybe what city and state you're from. If you're joining us from out of the US, maybe let us know which country you're joining us from. Let's check the chat. We've got some local people here from Allen, Texas, Garland, Little Rock, Arkansas, Vegas, Toronto, Turkey, Mexico, Austin, Dallas, Gainesville, Florida, hoping to move to Dallas soon. Hope you'll connect with us when you move here. Bedford, Texas, Santiago, Chile. Wow. Okay. Richmond, Virginia. Hello from Houston, Texas. Oh, and people are still coming in. Everybody's here to see Amber. This is this is quite a crowd gathering from all over. So yeah, welcome wherever you're joining us from. Yeah, we've had people coming from Cameroon and India and all kinds of places. So it's just always really fun to know where people are joining us from. Yeah, my name is Sadiqa Watson. I am a data scientist. I'm also currently serving as the organizer of Our Ladies Dallas, and the objective, I'm sure, as uh, if you've attended some of these events or if you're familiar with Our Ladies, is really just to promote the use of the R programming language, particularly for or women people who identify as women or non-binary. But also, because we're just, because a lot of content that we share is generic, we welcome men to participate as well. So definitely appreciate the men who have partnered with us as well. So just quickly, I'd like to admit someone else from the waiting room and another person. But I'd also like to share some information about our meetup. Um, so I'd like to share my screen. Okay. So I'm sure you visited the meetup page because you RSVP'd and you're here today. So if you look at our events page, you'll see that we have a few upcoming events. Of course, the one that you're attending now. We've got another speaker, Jennifer Victor, who's going to talk to us about network analysis. And we have a couple of speakers. They haven't solidified their topics yet, but those are coming up in May and June. So notice April, May, June, and we've got some other speakers who said that they were interested in giving us a presentation in the fall. So we've definitely got quite a lineup. What we like to do is to have a primary speaker who will talk about data science, talk about R, talk about maybe some R package that they're using or a use case that they thought was interesting, or also talk about just women, women in careers and women in data science careers or technical careers, just to help us as women or non-binary people to to grow in our career paths. So if you are interested in becoming a speaker, then you could definitely reach out to me, and we can find a topic and a time where you can share your content. Another path outside of being a primary speaker would be the path of a lightning speaker. So if you're interested in just maybe 5 to 10, 15 minutes, you just want to share something real quick. Maybe you don't want to even put slides together. You just want to do a demo of some cool thing that you learned in R, or some cool R package that you are using or that you built, or you want to preview a conference presentation that you just want to, get some feedback on. You're welcome to do that as an R Ladies Dallas presentation. So yeah, reach out to me if you want to give a lightning talk. So now would be the time where if you are our lightning speaker, then before our esteemed guest showed up, then you would actually be giving a brief presentation. So yeah, just let me know if that's something that you're interested in. And it could be, like I said, something very small. Maybe it's a homework problem, or maybe some, just like I said, just interesting R use case. So yeah, so that's our Ladies Dallas. I think that's everything that I normally say in the beginning. So without further ado, I'll admit another person. And then I will introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Amber Thomas. So, and actually, it was pretty cool. I met Amber through the Our Ladies speaker directory. So that's something that you might be interested in too. If you like giving presentations, or if you're saying, well, I really want to find a speaker who's a woman or non-binary who can speak at my event, but I just don't know a whole lot of women in this space, then that speaker directory is amazing. And it leads me to people, amazing people like Amber, with such an amazing background that I'm sure you'll hear about later today. But Amber is a senior journalist engineer at The Pudding, where her work focuses primarily on communicating complex topics and ideas, designing and developing data visualizations for the web, and improving the accessibility of information for a general audience. And then before starting at The Pudding in 2017, Amber was a marine biologist and a research scientist. So very interesting career path, and I'm sure we'll hear little nuggets about that as she progresses through her talk. Okay, yeah, and I'm really excited about this. Actually, one quick note, I guess, before I pass it over to Amber, that I thought was fun. So I asked her, I kind of gave her the rundown of, we talk about R, we talk about careers and so on. She was like, well, I really don't use R for much besides data cleaning, but I can talk about data storytelling all day. And I was like, yes, yes, yes. We don't have to discuss anything else, because data storytelling is such an important piece of data analysis. So, I remember back in my career, at the beginning of my career, when I was an intern, I had done this linear regression, and I had how you get the coefficient table, right? The table that has all the coefficients and the p-values and all that. And I just copied and pasted it into a Word document and handed it to my mentor, who's a biologist, right? She's not even a statistician or anything. So she's like, what is this? What does this mean? So, so I think that it's really important for us to figure out, okay, do the analysis, but then you have to communicate it to other people. What is the story that you want to convey in this? So that's a really, really critical piece that I don't think we really learn enough. So I'm happy that Amber is here to walk us through that. So yeah, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Amber.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. That's a fantastic story. And I got to tell you, I still sometimes get like people handing me things, and I am your advisor or mentor in that scenario, where sometimes people hand me data and they're really excited and I want to be excited with them, but I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at. So tell me why I should be excited. And then I'm excited, and then it's like a great day. But yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm so glad to hear you found me on the Our Ladies directory. I was wondering how you stumbled upon my contact info, but that's fabulous. I'm so glad we made contact. I think this is going to be fun. So feel free, everybody, to if you have questions throughout this talk, leave them in the chat for Zoom, or keep them somewhere. If you have a private question you want to ask me later, I will make my email accessible. Feel free to reach out and contact. But if you have questions during the talk that you want answered during the talk, feel free to put them in the chat and I will do my best to address them either as we go or at the end. Okay, amazing. So I'm Amber. I actually live in Seattle these days, but I've kind of bounced. I've never lived in Texas, but I have grew up in New England, lived in Florida for a while, spent some time in Hawaii, live in Washington. So I've been kind of bouncing around the US for a while now. And these days I am a senior journalist engineer at the Pudding, and I will get into what that means because that sounds kind of like a whole bunch of made up words. Yeah, so here we go. Let me share my screen and hopefully I will get this working. I was talking earlier about how I always mess up Zoom whenever I use it. So, oops, hold on. Share screen, this one, there we go. I have too many monitors and it always wants to share the wrong one. Okay. Can someone verify that you can see my slide?
Yep, we see it.
Amazing, thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the data stories that we tell at the Pudding and how we go from coming up with an idea to a final data story project. So if you're unfamiliar with the Pudding, I'm going to be showing you little examples of some of our work throughout this presentation, but just as sort of a background information, we are a small group of creators. I like to joke that we kind of just make weird, fun things on the internet. But basically we are creating data and visually driven stories for the internet. And largely the stories we write about are not things you would find in the news cycle, but they are things focused on culture and questions in the sort of general realm of culture, which, as you'll see as I talk, covers a very wide range of topics. And my job there, as you've heard me say a few times now, is a senior journalist engineer. I already broke my navigation here. Okay. So as I was saying, this job title sounds made up because it is. Our team was having a really hard time coming up with what we should call ourselves because our roles are kind of very vague and expansive. So I'll break down for you what my role actually means. So the senior part is what senior means in most roles. I've been working in this role for a while. I can work independently. I can lead a project. I can work with freelancers or other people on a project and help them guide their idea to completion. The journalist part is potentially also pretty straightforward. It means I can do the skills of a journalist. So that includes everything from figuring out how a story should be structured, writing the prose, checking sources. Sometimes this means I do interviews, but a lot of times it's a lot of work like a research scientist might do where you're accessing sources, learning information, making sure that you are structuring a story and giving all of the necessary contextual information for readers to understand what you're talking about so that you aren't just handing them data and being really excited, but the reader has no idea why you're excited. The engineer part is, again, kind of like it's more of a software engineering role. This is where I use R. So in this part of my role, I use a lot of tools for collecting and analyzing data, cleaning data, as I'm sure you all know, cleaning data is a very time-consuming task. I do a lot of front-end web development, which if you're unfamiliar, don't worry about it, but it basically means making content available on the internet. A lot of times for us, that means the content is interactive. So you might be able to filter a graphic or hover for tooltips or zoom in a particular area or something like that. So I do a lot of programming to make our things available on the internet, often interactive. And lately I've also been focusing a lot on accessibility, both in terms of like technical accessibility, making sure our content is accessible for screen reader users and keyboard users and all sorts of different people who may want to read our stories. But that also encompasses things like how we write and the way that we describe things and making sure that we're not using a lot of jargon and things that people may not be able to understand. So I can do all of these things. There's another part of my role that isn't really incorporated here, which is design. Basically figuring out what type of data visualization is most appropriate, how that should be structured, what kinds of colors to use, and font styles and sizes, and all of those sorts of things kind of fall into my role as well. And everybody on my team has the ability to do all of these things. Some of us have our sort of like favorite tasks or the tasks that are our bread and butter. For me, that's definitely this sort of engineering role. So I can do all of the other roles. But this engineering role is nice and kind of cozy for me. I like coding and programming and finding data and analyzing it and translating like raw data into something that people can understand. So this is where I like to spend most of my time when I'm given the opportunity to choose. So part of the reason I think that that is my sort of comfy working zone is because, as you heard earlier, my background is actually in marine biology. So I went to college and graduate school for marine biology. I worked as a research scientist in an aquarium for several years, studying animals. Also, I feel like I always need to give context to these pictures. So this was a sea turtle that was being transferred. It was after it had been rehabilitated. So turtles get involved in a lot of cold shock events, which people in Texas are very familiar with right now because that happened just a few weeks ago to a lot of turtles. And this seal here is getting a dive tag attached. He was totally fine. He just looks super grumpy in the picture. So anyway, I used to do a lot of research with animals. Um, and when I went into this field of marine biology, I thought my day would look like this 90% of the time. But in reality, my day was mostly me sitting at a desk, researching papers, coming up with new experiments and research projects, analyzing data, collecting data, writing papers, writing grant proposals, things like that. I spent a lot of time not interacting with animals. So I was sort of building all of these other skills. And one of the other things I worked on a lot without even really realizing I was doing it was science communication. So I, as an undergraduate student, used to volunteer to give tours through our labs because I thought it was fun. I loved giving presentations. In grad school, I had a fellowship where I was teaching with kindergarten through 12th grade classrooms a few times a week. So I would go in and be a scientist and just like talk to kids about science, and it was really fun. And in my job as a research scientist at an aquarium, we were often doing research in front of guests. So I had to talk to people about my work. And at an aquarium, a lot of those people are children. So I spent a lot of time explaining really complex scientific research to kids or to people who may not otherwise be scientists. It's not like I was going to scientific conferences and doing this all the time. It was mostly the quote unquote general public. And so I started really enjoying this idea of communicating complex information. And I found myself spending a lot of time making visuals that helped describe what I was doing and what I was learning to all of these people I was talking to. So a lot of skills that I ended up building up in this role. And so I ended up eventually making a transition to the world of sort of data journalism. Now, on my team, I mentioned there's only a handful of us. So right now there's 7 of us, and we all come from really wide backgrounds. So these are everyone's what they either went to school for or the sort of careers they found themselves in before joining the pudding. And so you can see that we have a pretty wide spread of background information. And I think for us that works really well because it gives us a really wide spread of um, things that we find interesting and just things that we enjoy doing. So I mentioned that sort of engineering role is kind of where I like to be. My colleague Jan, who used to do photojournalism work, she really likes the design world, which is perfect because I don't love the design part as much. And so we often work together and can come up with really cool stories together. So our team has a pretty wide variety of backgrounds, but all of us have sort of overlapping skills that we're able to carry over. So again, for me, there was a lot of overlap between my old career and my current one. And there's only a few things that I really consider to be very different. Again, I don't really work with animals anymore, though I have a dog now, so I work with him. It's not quite the same, but it's still very fun. And I don't really do peer-reviewed research anymore, which honestly I'm not too upset about because that was anybody who's done peer-reviewed research can probably tell you it's not always a fun experience. But the other thing is in this sort of data journalism world, I'm dealing with a much larger audience. Obviously, we are putting stuff just like on the internet. And so the whole internet can be your audience, which can be great, but also can not always be fun because the internet has a lot of opinions. And yeah, peer-reviewed research. I'm watching the chat as I talk to you all. Peer research is not always a good time. But the other part, the other part of this that was very different for me is that this is a much quicker turnaround. So our projects typically take anywhere from 1 to like 3 months to do, which is much longer than you would find in a lot of journalism outlets that are doing like breaking news, where they need to be putting stuff out every single day. But it's a lot slower, or I'm sorry, a lot faster than you would find in scientific research, where I was coming up with new ideas like once a year, once every 6 months. In this role, I'm coming up with new story ideas several every month just to have a whole bunch of them. And that has been like this part here, this quicker turnaround has been like the part that's been hardest for me. And it's something I still struggle with. And I think it's also a little bit, again, why I tend to like that engineering role, because this part is hard. So I'm going to chat with you a little bit about how we come up with ideas for data stories, because it can be really challenging. And yeah, it's something that I think people don't always know where the ideas come from. So I will preface this with saying that we tend to approach data story ideas a little bit differently than a lot of data folks I know. So you absolutely don't have to do it this way, but this is how we do it. So a lot of folks I know start with a data set and then start exploring that data set once they've got it. We tend to start with a question and then get our own data set, or find a data set that helps us to answer that question, which is close to like how scientific research works. You know, you have a research question and you try to answer it. But I found that some data folks, especially when people are really new to the field, you know, there's so many like open data sets out there, and it's really exciting because this is exactly what I did when I was first starting as well. Is I would go and find all of these open data sets and get really excited, and then be really overwhelmed that I didn't know what to do with all of this data. And I knew there was something cool in there, but I didn't know how to get at it. And so for us, we start with a question because it gives us a clear starting point. It helps us scope the work that we're doing and what we're looking at, and it helps to keep us from getting completely buried in data. Now, this next thing is going to be my favorite thing I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you several times because I think it's the best advice I've gotten since I've started in this field, which is to keep a backlog of ideas. This can be anywhere. I keep mine in a program called Notion. You can keep it on your phone or in a physical notebook or somewhere. I would recommend not keeping it in your head because you might forget. But basically what this is every time that you are just like living your life and a random question pops in your head, write down. Even if it's just a random thought. Like I have had an idea on my backlog for several years that just says fairy tales question mark, and that I don't know what to do with that. I don't currently have a story or a question about fairy tales, but sometimes after a while you'll come back to your backlog and be like, oh, I just had this really cool idea about fairy tales, and now I know how that can become a story, or I can at least exploring it to see if it can become a story. And this has happened to me several times where an idea from like 2 years ago that was kind of I call them half-baked, like they're not full story ideas, they're like vague notions. They eventually may or may not get turned into a full story. So keep a backlog of ideas. It can be really helpful. Our team backlog is public, so feel free to check it out. Feel free to take any of those ideas and create your own story with them if you have interest. If you want to try pitching one of our ideas back to us, let us know. We have pitch requirements on our website, but we do accept freelance pitches. So feel free to pitch one of our ideas back or pitch us your own ideas if you have something you're excited about. Okay, so you've got your backlog started. What do you put on it? For us, we come up with ideas from a lot of different places. And I used to just tell people that they come from life, like story ideas come from conversations or from TV or books or like just wherever. Um, but when I really started thinking about the types of situations that have spurred ideas for me or the types of things that work really well in this medium, I've kind of figured out there's a few like broad categories that this type of storytelling is a really good medium for. So the first is a sort of debate or argument, and this is actually the pudding's bread and butter. um, Quick aside, the reason that we're called the pudding is because our original tagline was that we created stories around topics debated in culture. And when you're in a debate, you want to find the proof that you are right or that your opponent is wrong. And where do you find the proof? The pudding, right? So we are the pudding. We hold the proof for your side of the argument. And so things that you debate with one another, with other people, with friends, family, whatever, these types of things could potentially make for a really great data story. Here's a few examples. I mentioned I grew up in New England. It snows a lot there. And every time it snowed when I was younger, I remember people being like, oh, there's going to be a baby boom in 9 months because everybody's stuck at home for the next several days. And so obviously there's going to be a bunch of babies born 9 months from now. And I think this was just such a fascinating thing that like came up all the time. And I just always thought it was a weird concept. And so I decided that this would be an interesting thing to look at. Like there is data around when babies are born and when like natural disasters or big events happen, we can like answer this. So I at least took a stab at trying to answer whether babies tend to be born after events like blizzards. Mostly no. But this type of story lends itself really well to this type of storytelling. This next example is a hill I will die on. The pockets in jeans marketed to women are too small, like so much smaller than the pockets in jeans marketed to men. And this has been like a thorn in my side for years. And a few years ago, my colleague Jan and I decided to write a whole story about it because not that this is necessarily up for debate, but sometimes I would bring this up to friends that wear men's jeans and they'd be like, your pockets can't possibly be that small. And then I would, of course, go through this whole charade of like having them try to put stuff in my pockets, which gets you nowhere. But it's a whole thing where we were able to get data to show people like, no, no, no. Like the pockets in jeans marketed to women are noticeably smaller, so much smaller. So again, this sort of debate is a really great starting point for a story like this. There's another group of ideas that I that I tend to write a lot about, and these are things that you personally know a lot about, and you may not realize that other people don't know a lot about that thing. So I found that when you're in a field for a long time, you pick up stuff and you sometimes forget what it's like when you were not like in this field for a long time. And so you've acquired a lot of knowledge that other people would actually be very interested in, but you don't think to tell a story about it because you kind of assume this is like common knowledge now, but often it's not. So again, examples. When I first started at the pudding, like I said, I had been a marine biologist not long before. And often I would get into conversations with aquarium guests about captive whales and dolphins. Specifically, when you're at aquariums and zoos in the US, where these animals came from. Now, for me, I had been in this field for a long time, so I was very confident in telling them that the US had not captured wild animals into zoos and aquariums since the early 90s, and they stopped without any laws having to go into place. And all of the animals that are new to the facility since then have been born there. And this is all information that I knew. And I thought other people did, but I realized that I was having this conversation all the time, which eventually made me realize that not everybody did know this information. It wasn't as common as I thought. And so taking something that I was very familiar with and translating it into a story where I could sort of walk people through it worked really well. Here's another example where that happened. I mentioned I live in Seattle, and I don't know if all of you know this about Seattle, but if you want to adopt or rescue a dog in this city, it's really hard to do that because there are not very many animals up for adoption here. And when they go really fast. And it like it it's such an interesting concept, at least for me, because people are like, you should adopt a dog if you want a dog or whatever. But it was very difficult to do that because they were in such high demand. Such high demand that the city actually imports dogs from other states and sometimes other countries to fill the demand for rescue animals that exist here. And this actually happens across the US. And you may not realize that in some place like Texas specifically, because Texas, as far as I've heard at least, you all have a lot of stray dogs. And so Texas is actually one of the states that exports a lot of animals to other states. And places like Seattle import those animals and adopt them out to homes. And this was something that I knew because I had tried to adopt a dog in Seattle, and it was a lot of like hassle trying to do it. And so I had become like deeply involved in this like concept of animals being moved state to state in the like rescue industry. And I kind of mentioned it in an offhand conversation to a friend one day, just kind of said it like it was nothing. And they like literally stopped walking and were like, I'm sorry, say that again. What? Like dogs come from where? They aren't just like stray Seattle dogs you're adopting here. And so I realized that again, this was something I knew a lot about, but other people maybe didn't know and might find interesting. And so I wrote a whole story about it on where dogs in the US come from and where they might go when they're moved around the country. Another type that works really well with this sort of medium is something that's difficult to explain. Specifically for us, we use this with things like theories a lot. And so my colleague Russell has done a whole explainer on how the birthday paradox works, where like the likelihood of you and someone else in a room sharing your birthday is probably much higher than you would think, and gets into the statistics of why that happens. He and I also worked on a story last year that we called the Infinite Monkey Experiment. And this is based on the theorem that if you had an infinite number of monkeys and an infinite number of typewriters, they could eventually type the works of Shakespeare. And so we kind of took the idea for that experiment, flipped it a little bit, and said if we had an infinite number of digital monkeys, i.e., computer programs, and an infinite number of piano keyboards, how long would it take for them to play various melodies? Especially when you take into account things like the length of a note or the pause between notes or how many keys are available to said digital monkey. And so we created this explainer that sort of slowly walks you through the idea, the probability, and then it shows you live examples. Let's see, this will work, of it guessing and trying to play the correct tune. So these like little shaded blocks would be the correct tune that it should be playing, and it is doing really poorly. This has been running for the past year. It is currently trying to play Happy Birthday. We estimate it'll do that sometime in the next 2 years. So things like theorems that are really complex, but interesting, like mathematical theorems, are really good for this sort of like visual explanation. The last is kind of a vague category, and it can really kind of go into any of the other topics I've already talked about. But I kind of couldn't figure out how else to like categorize the rest of it. A question you have about the world. So sometimes it's not necessarily a debate. It's not necessarily something you already know, but you're interested in it and you just think other people might be too. So my colleague Jan was working on this story earlier this year, trying to figure out what other names could be used the same way that Karen is used. Of course, the name Karen being used to represent a typically middle-aged white woman of a certain level of privilege. And so she was trying to figure out a way to find what other names could be used in that same way. They were popular at the same time. They had the same like sharp drop off in popularity. So they're really only used mostly by people who were born at a certain time frame and they had a certain level of popularity and all of these things. And so she kind of just used this as a way to talk about what other names could be used. She was also looking at names to find the male Karen. So like David, I think, was what she came up with as the male equivalent of Karen mathematically and things like that. So that can work as a type of story as well. Another example, this came to us from a freelancer a few years ago, but I just really love this piece. A freelancer came to us and wanted to talk about Vogue and the colorism that exists among the models on Vogue's covers. So mostly Vogue talks a lot, and a lot of fashion and beauty industries talk a lot about how they are starting to hire people of different races at a higher concentration than they used to. But there is this sort of question about whether they're actually representing women of all shades. So they worked through all of this data, extracting out the colors of the model's skin tone as reflected on the cover of the magazine, and really got a look at what sorts of skin tone shades were actually being represented on the covers. So again, these sort of questions about the world can also make really great stories when using this sort of visual data storytelling medium. One second. Okay, so those are lots of different ways you can come up with story ideas. We also have random ones that are just like, we just wanted to make something on the internet that was cool. So we have like an internet boy band database that is just boy bands from the 80s until like 2 years ago. And they are just little characters that dance and they move in chronological order, and it's just really fun. So sometimes we do stuff like that as well, but those are usually more just like one-off stories. So lots and lots of options. But now that you've got your idea, what do we do with it? Because it's not immediately turned into a data story that can go on the internet. So we start by asking whether your question or idea is unique. And by this, I don't mean like, has anyone in the world ever asked this question before? But I mean, is your framing of this different to other people who have tackled this in the past? So for instance, one of my old story ideas was about whether the book version of something is better than the movie version of something. As somebody who likes to read, I often find myself comparing books and movies, and I thought this would be interesting. But a quick Google search shows, that a lot of people have already tried to answer this question using data. And I took a look at how they were doing it, and I was like, that's exactly how I would do it. I don't think that I have anything to add to that conversation. So I have shelved that idea and I have not come back to it yet. Apologies, it's very dry in here apparently. On the flip side, my team and I had this question a few years ago about how far people have to drive to abortion clinics in the US. Now, this is something that other people had asked before, and they had come up with a sort of data solution to answer this question. But we had a different approach to the question. So people often talked about driving from, say, a city center to an abortion clinic, but they were showing you distance as the crow flies. So like direct distance between 2 points. We were more interested in how long it would take to drive there. So obviously, there's not always a road that will directly connect you from your city center to said abortion clinic or to the nearest one, because there's just no geographical way that that's always possible. So we really wanted to know how driving times were affected. So we decided this was different enough from the stories that had been told before that we were having a slightly different conversation, or we were adding to the conversation that people were already having about abortion clinic access in the States. So that was something we felt was different enough to move forward. So for us, we want to make sure that we're doing something unique enough that we're not just recreating what other people have done, we are actually adding to it. Okay, so we usually check our ideas against these criteria, and we don't have to hit all of these, but these are usually good metrics of whether something is going to um, work really well in this medium, at least for the way that we tell these stories. So we start by asking if this question would spark debate. And the easiest way to test this is you bring it up to somebody and see if they just go, okay, cool. Or if they start talking about it. So for instance, earlier when I mentioned the pocket situation, and this happens every time I talk about the pocket situation, even though that piece was published like years ago, as soon as I bring it up, people are like, hell yeah, I hate the pockets in women's jeans. They're too small. It's ridiculous. Let me tell you about this time that I dropped my phone on the floor and it cracked because it fell out of my pocket. It happens every time. Like that is something that's very easy to get people fired up about. And so it often is something like if you can get people to, they don't have to be that fired up, but if you can get them to kind of like lean in, like, I'm telling a story about this. Oh, interesting. Tell me more. Like, if people start like leaning in and wanting to know more about that topic, you're probably on a good path. Now, like I said, you don't have to hit all of these criteria because there are some topics that like not everyone is going to be interested in, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't tell that story. So definitely feel free to like pitch it to a few people and see like maybe your framing of it could use some work, or maybe the way you're bringing it up, or things like that. Some sort of slight fluctuations may help you get better feedback on the way that approaching this story might make it more widely interesting, for lack of a better phrase. This next one kind of goes hand in hand with that. Are you excited about it? Like I had done a bunch of projects before I started here that were just like me practicing data tasks, and like they were interesting and stuff, but I wasn't like really jazzed to tell people about them. Like I did one on like bike share use in Seattle and it was like vaguely interesting, but I was like, well, this pretty much makes sense. People borrow bikes at the top of the big hill and then they leave them at the bottom of the big hill, and okay. And because I wasn't super excited, my audience wouldn't be super excited. But if I'm like, did you know that dogs are like moved from all of these other places to be made available in Seattle? Isn't that like wild? Your audience is more likely to be excited about it as well. So make sure it's something you're excited about. And of course, if you're talking about telling this story visually, do visuals actually help communicate the story? Because there are a lot of fantastic stories out there that just don't necessarily need visuals to help them. So you want to make sure that if you're going to create a story that incorporates visuals, make sure that they are not just like decoration. And not that there's anything against decorating an article, but for us at least, we try to make sure that the visuals are just as important, if not more important, than the writing that goes into that story. The visuals are driving it. Now, of course, again, for this type of story, we often end up asking ourselves if this is a question that can be answered with data. So here's what I mean. That pocket story, again, sorry, I keep talking about it, but I'm telling you, it's just it's so important to me. So I have a lot of questions about pockets, but not all of them can be answered by data. So I could have asked, like, what can I even fit in these pockets? Who can I blame for this because I'm really mad? And where can I find bigger pockets? Now, all of these are totally valid questions, and I could have written an article about any of these. But the thing is, these questions can't really be answered by data. And so I could have written like a prose-driven article that like explored the history of pockets, and we do get into that into our article as well. But visuals really weren't needed to answer any of these questions. Data wasn't needed. I couldn't use data in this way, but reframing the questions just a little bit made it so that I could talk about pockets and use data. So questions like, are women's pockets smaller than men? If so, how much smaller? And how does this affect people who wear women's jeans? So like, what are they being restricted from actually keeping in their pockets? The slight reframing um, really helped to make sure that, yes, I can answer these questions using data. Yes, visuals would help me tell this story. And yes, this also kind of helps that debate angle of like providing proof to the people that I'm arguing with that I want and need bigger pockets. So make sure your questions can actually be answered by data. Now, this is sometimes a tricky one of whether the data exists. So often for our types of stories, the data don't exist. Sometimes it does. Often, if we are finding data, we are using resources that are open and available. So things like data.gov, Kaggle, data.world, Wikipedia, these are all great sources of open information. And sometimes you can get a data set that somebody else collected that can be used perfectly to answer your question. I've used data from the CDC. The dog data I was talking about came from Pet Finder, so I just needed to use their API to collect it. Took a lot of cleaning, but I didn't have to go out and like call up rescues and shelters around the country to get that data manually. So a lot of times we can either find a data set, create one through scraping or use of APIs. Sometimes it has to be done manually. So the pocket piece, again, Jan and I went to brick and mortar stores and found jeans that were the brand and size and style we needed, went into dressing rooms, literally measured pockets. And we did that for like 2 weeks. I should also note if you're going to do stuff like that, depending on where you are and what's happening, like obviously do be careful. Jan and I go into stores with a lot of privilege as white women, and people really weren't going to stop us from like going into the dressing rooms and spending like a weirdly long amount of time in there. Jan did get kicked out of one store, but mostly we didn't get in any sort of trouble. But you know, just if you're going out into the real world and collecting data, do be careful. But yeah, so that does happen on occasion where we have to manually collect data and use that to try to answer our question. And there are some times where we get to this point and we're like, we would have to manually collect this data and we can't. And sometimes we just stop working on a story right here because we can't get the data we need to answer the question in a way that we want to be able to answer it. And that's okay. I should normalize that we sometimes drop stories at various parts of this process, and like that is fine. So don't feel bad if that happens. Okay. Ethics. At this point, you have data or you have a way to collect it. We like to stop and reflect here on whether it's ethical to collect or use the data. So think a lot about what the data is, where it came from, who's being included, who's being excluded from the data. Was the data, if you didn't collect it, was it collected in an ethical way? Is it okay for you to use it in the way that you are planning to use it? Sometimes there are open data sources that you can use, but you probably shouldn't. For instance, there's a database of prisoners in Florida that releases their mugshots. You can use that data. You really shouldn't. Those people did not consent to having their faces used in your data project or whatever you're planning on doing with it. It's just not, it's not an ethically good idea. So this is definitely something I always recommend people to just like stop, think about it, make sure that this is good, like ethically feels okay. At that point, collect the data. And if you already have it, analyze it. And this is like so hard for me to like put on a slide to encompass how much time I spend cleaning data. Because every time I say that I'm going to do just like a quick, tiny little project, I spend like 3 weeks cleaning data. Now, I should note I am an R user. Not everybody on my team is. So we use a wide variety of products. or tools or whatever to analyze our data. And it really just depends on everybody's personal preference. I'm an R user. I love R. I think it's fabulous. I think I still clean data faster than anybody else, but cleaning data takes a long time, depending on what it is. And so we spend a lot of time in this phase usually. Yeah. Now at that point, you have some results. And this is like kind of a hard comparison to make, but like at this point, we ask if the results are interesting. Now, again, that a little bit depends on like interesting to who. So you want to make sure that they're interesting to you, first of all, because if you're not interested anymore, do you want to keep working on this? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes talking to somebody else, if you're a little unsure and they're like, oh my gosh, that's fascinating, tell me more, that can get you re-energized about it. But sometimes you just get to a point and you're like, here's the results, and everyone's like, okay, and that's okay. And sometimes we will ask a different question, and sometimes we will just end it completely. And that's fine. We've like pivoted several stories at this point. Russell and I were working on a story a few years ago. He had this idea about library books and was really curious if we could talk about library books the way we talk about income. So he was like, can we say that 99% of the checkouts come from 1% of the books? And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. I don't know. So we looked at library checkout data and it was not very interesting. It was like, actually, there's people check out a wide variety of books and there doesn't seem to be like any major patterns that we're seeing across the board. And so we tried asking a few different questions because at that point we already had the data set. And we ended up flipping the idea on its head and decided to look at the books that nobody had checked out in like a decade. And we created what we called the hipster summer reading list. And it was just the list of books that nobody had checked out in at least 10 years. And it was just kind of like a weird exploration of books and which books are being checked out and which are not. But it's not what we originally set out to do, but we found it way more interesting than our original findings. So this is a lot like the ethics question. There's no way to measure this, but this is something we always take a minute to pause and reflect on as well. And that's whether you personally are the right person to tell this story. So there are a lot of times where like you might get really excited about an idea and start going down a path and you have questions and you want to answer them. And then you realize that I am not writing about something that has happened in my own personal experience. And hopefully this realization happens much earlier. Like hopefully you realize this in the early like idea conception phase, but if you didn't, you definitely should consider it here. And so a lot of times what we do is we work with people who are like professionals, if this is like a field of study that we're not super familiar with, and we want to make sure that we are even asking the right questions because sometimes we're not. And we want to make sure that we are presenting the information in a way that is consistent with the way that like academics or other people would talk about it or analyze it, but also is presented in a way that can be reflective of the lived experiences of the people we're talking about. And often we do that by bringing in people to like collaborate with us or to help us write a piece or to at least consult with us on and making sure that we are framing everything in the right way. If it's, again, something that's outside of our own experiences, we often also work with sensitivity readers to make sure that, again, that we're framing the story in the right way for the right topic. So this sort of stuff is also really important to us to make sure that we are the right people to be telling a story in the way that we're telling it. And there have been times where we put stuff down here or we like make sure, like I said, bring other people in to make sure that we're doing this right. Okay, at this point, you need to create a plan. You have your data, you have your results, you have an idea that you are okay with being the person to tell this story, you feel okay moving forward. And so you need to come up with what kind of story you're going to tell or how you're going to present your results. Now, like any sort of storytelling, you can approach this from a few ways. We tend to do either like the triangle or the inverted triangle options. So either you start with something very specific and get out to the much larger sort of topic at hand, or you start with the big picture and you like walk the reader into something a little bit more focused. So again, examples. I wrote a story last year about rainfall and precipitation. I live in Seattle. The thing people ask me all the time is like, how do you live in Seattle? It rains all the time. But excuse me, it doesn't actually rain all the time in Seattle. And I kind of just got annoyed with people asking me that all the time. So I wrote a whole article about it. And this article geolocates you to your location. And so where it says New York here, for you all, it would say Dallas or wherever you actually are. And so this is an idea of starting really small. You're starting at the reader's city and walking them out to this idea that it rains in a lot of places. And when we talk about annual precipitation, we are not always like talking about or perceiving the same thing. But we're starting with a very tiny and familiar point about you and where you are located. The flip side, the pockets article again, I did not realize how much I talk about this, but I really do love it. With this, we started really broad. Pockets in general, here's like a drawing of like 80 pockets, just without a lot of context, and started walking the user through, okay, here's 80 pockets. We'll overlay all of the ones intended or marketed to women and all of the ones marketed to men. And we see that the ones marketed to women are much smaller. And then we start walking them through like, okay, what does this mean? Does that mean I can't fit a cell phone in my pocket? What kind of cell phone? What about my hand? What about a wallet or a pen? What about like skinny versus straight like style pants? What about back pockets? So we started with something very broad, like all of the data, and then we sort of brought them down to narrower and narrower questions. So you can really tell a story in whichever order makes more sense to you. And sometimes we mock up both and try to get an idea of like which one makes more sense for the way we want to tell it, like which one feels more natural in the telling of the story.
Hey,
So definitely, yeah.
yeah, just a quick question
Mhm.
that I had, and if you have for the people attending, if you have some questions, we can go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll make sure that we go ahead and ask them during the session. But yeah, I just was curious to know. I see some really nice visuals. Like I see the pockets, for example, and I see the like the outline of the pocket for the O and the colors and
Mhm.
little dogs, like the different kinds of dogs, like the numbers of dogs. Like, how do you get that kind of intuition? Do you have some kind of a visualization
Mhm.
expert on staff, somebody in graphic design or anything, or is that something that you guys just kind of picked up along the way, or did you do any training?
A little bit of both. We don't do a ton of training, though I wish we did, because the overall page design is not my like strong suit. I'm pretty decent at like visualization design, but I usually have my colleague Jan come in and do like a polish round at the end of like tweaking font sizes or colors or just adding little bits and pieces that make it really like pop. So she's the one that like did the little pocket shape here and made this look like stitching. And I think that was just such a clever idea. Her background is in design, so she just has a good eye for that. I do watch her work sometimes and I'll ask her like, why did you move that there? And she's like, I don't know, it just felt good. And so I think like she just has a really good like intuition for it. Um, the dog piece in particular, I had actually worked with a freelance designer for that. So I was experimenting with what it would be like to work with somebody outside of our team to like come in and help with the design of an article and things like that. So that one looks a little bit different from some of our other articles, but yeah, a lot of times we just experiment and some of it is intuition and some of it, I mean, we have like fonts that we tend to use and like very rough ideas of like if your title is this big, maybe your subtitle should be this big, like vaguely. Um, but we kind of make it up as we go. I don't think that's a satisfying answer. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we also try to bring in elements of what we're talking about. So I think that's a little bit of it too. Like talking about jeans, making the piece blue makes you kind of feel like we're talking about jeans. Like this piece about rain, I kind of tried to make it this like grayish purple because when things are rainy, they're kind of a little bit more gray, but I wanted more color than gray. And, so we can kind of incorporate that a little bit, but yeah, sorry, I recognize that's not super helpful.
And we've got a question in the chat. On that note, what
Yeah,
tools, if any, do you use for storyboarding prior to programming?
that is a perfect segue. I was just about to talk about that. So I will go back to what I was talking about. So yeah, once you know the kind of like structure you want your story to take, you figure out what the right chart type would be. For us, sometimes that includes like traditional or experimental charts. I realize I have like one more slide before I get to your answer. So the quick answer is that we use a lot of different tools. Mostly we use a tool called Figma, and I will show you what that looks like in like one slide, but I didn't want to like get distracted. So let me know if I answer your question like 2 slides from now. So for us, we use like standard traditional chart types like bar charts and scatter plots and line charts and stuff like that. But we also use a lot of experimental charts because we can. So this first one here is a Sankey diagram. My colleagues Russell and Matt worked on this, where it's actually very fun. I'll have to send you all the link, but basically it's like a spelling test or a spelling quiz to see if you can spell the names of celebrities. So if you're trying to spell Britney Spears' name, you would type a B-R-I, and then most people would type a T next. And so this would be the break off of the Sankey plot here. But if you typed an N, you would start down this path and you do T, then N. But if you did another T, it would go this way. And basically this Sankey diagram like is created as you type. And so this was like weirdly experimental. And like, I remember when they were working on it, they were like, people might hate this, but it turns out it's actually very fun. So very glad that they were able to work on that. The pockets, as I was mentioning before, we decided we could have shown all of our data on like pocket sizes as bar charts or something like that. Would have totally made sense to compare like the length and width of pockets. But we were talking so much about pockets, and we really felt like showing the shape of them directly rather than extrapolating it out as like how many centimeters or millimeters of like length versus width would really be more powerful. So we decided to show the actual shapes of the pockets, which is unusual, but I think a little bit more intuitive in that case. Very out of the norm for me. I worked on a sports story a couple years ago that was about basketball and how many people who were ranked in the top 100 when they were in high school actually made it into the NBA. And we decided to make this graphic kind of animated like Plinko. So you start with all these little orange circles, reminiscent of basketballs, and they start at the top and then they kind of drop down and they bounce onto the different levels and they kind of just land eventually where they are, and you end up with kind of like like a barcode plot, but it's an animated basketball-y style of barcode plot. Again, weird and experimental. We play with this stuff a lot. This one we were calling a kind of worm graph for a while, but it was meant to show the growth of popularity on, I think this was Wikipedia, for various people over a period of time. And so the more popular they got, the wider the little worm got, and also the more pink instead of yellow. And so there was a lot of experimentation with playing with weird shapes for this particular chart. So sometimes we'll decide to make an experimental chart that just is weird, and we like fully go into that knowing that people might hate this. And we try not to make anything that that like everybody hates, but sometimes we're like, we like this, somebody might not, but let's try it and see. And if people do like it, now we have a new chart type in our back pocket to use for other types of stories. Okay, this is that Figma tool I was talking about. Sorry, it took me a while to get here. So this is a lot like if you've ever used like Adobe Illustrator or something like that. It's basically a tool that designers can use. A lot of front-end designers use this, and it lets you sort of mock up like an entire web page. And it's pretty open-ended. So you can like draw with like a pen tool or a pencil. You can bring in different images or colors, and you can like, we bring in graphics. I will often bring in graphics from R when I'm like experimenting and putting stuff into like a storyboard in Figma. So I'll export something from R as an SVG and put it into Figma to play around with and get an idea of how that would fit into the whole picture. So this is what a lot of my team uses. Some of my team members have found that it's faster to like do a quick pencil sketch and then just jump straight into the coding of the front end page. Some people like doing that. Some people like having a plan. I personally like having a plan just so I don't, otherwise I get really overwhelmed and I forget what I wanted to make and I end up like with a half-made article and no plan. So I like having stuff mocked up in Figma personally. It gives me something to fall back on of like, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to come next, or that's how I wanted that chart to look, or something like that. Highly recommend. It's very fun. It's also, Figma is collaborative, so it would be the Google Docs version of Illustrator. So like other people can be in and working on the design while you're working on it. Did that answer your question?
And yes.
Yay, okay.
Great.
Awesome. Let me come back to the one about the original idea in a few minutes. I see it, I will get back to you. But I'm almost through this, so I think it'll be easier at the end. Okay, at this point, once you have a storyboard, and again, the storyboard can kind of change. Sometimes it does because sometimes we mock up graphics and then we actually start coding them out and we're like, oh, this actually looks really terrible. And we'll like go back to the drawing board and change it and try again. But usually at this point, we make the thing, which I recognize is like not very complete as to all the work that goes into creating the actual piece. We tend to use a lot of tools for making something on the internet. The most common that we use is D3, which is a JavaScript library that a lot of people use for data visualization specifically. But we also use things like Mapbox, which makes making maps a lot easier, or Flourish, which is a bit like Tableau or Power BI in that it helps you create charts without as much like coding. So sometimes we do use those tools. We do sometimes make things in R, and just usually I'll bring them into Figma and just like clean them up manually a little bit. But sometimes we have static graphics that are pretty much from R or something like that. I always like to tell people this too, because sometimes I think people get overwhelmed with the number of tools that you could use. The first chart that my colleague Matt made that actually ended up causing the pudding to be created. It was a graphic about the vocabulary of rappers. He made this chart, it went viral, led to the creation of our company and the reason I have a job. That chart was made in PowerPoint. And so I always like to tell people that like, yes, there are a lot of fancy tools out there, but at least for our purposes, the story is more important than the tools. So if you can make a graphic that helps you tell your story in R or in Excel or in PowerPoint, like go ahead and make it in there, as long as it's, of course, you know, accurate to the way that people interpret data and things like that. But we are very tool agnostic, like use whatever you're comfortable with and whatever works to tell this particular story. So just because we use these tools, don't feel like you need to be using these tools to do something in this space. With that, that's basically like the end of our story. At that point, we have a thing, it's on the internet, and we just like share it on Twitter and it's done. And that's like the whole life cycle of a pudding story. And so for us, it all kind of boils down to that backlog of ideas and making sure you keep it like full of ideas and fresh and rotating things through, get feedback at a lot of different phases, because it really helps to figure out like how to shape your story and places where people are interested or where they kind of lose interest a little bit. And at least for us, we really talk a lot about having fun. Like we, which sounds kind of silly, but you know, you want to be excited about the stories you're telling if you want your readers to be excited. So the more fun you're having, the more people will enjoy reading your piece as well. With that, okay, questions. there was a question about how much we end up diverting from the original idea of a story. Do you mean like in like how different is the final version from the original version? Okay. Um, I think that really this is an unsatisfying answer. It depends. I think a lot of our stories do change a little bit. Um, because sometimes, since we're starting with a question, we don't even know if the data is necessarily all even there to answer the question appropriately. So sometimes once we start digging into the data, we find like maybe there's a slightly better way to frame this or something like that. Um, yeah, okay. Let me rephrase it like this. It's pretty rare for something to be exactly the way it was imagined in the idea form in its final form. It usually changes at least some. Sometimes it's just a little, sometimes it's just the framing of the story has changed a little bit. But we do a lot of feedback sessions with our team where people bring a lot of ideas and are like, hey, that's cool. Have you considered this? And it just, all of those just kind of tweak and change the direction that your story was going to take just a little bit. So that by the time you get to the end, it might have moved quite a bit, but at least for us, I think that's for the better. Did that answer your question? I'm also going to stop sharing so I can.
Yes. Okay. Looks like that was an answer to that
Yay.
question. So great. Cool. Yeah, if you have other questions, please add them to the chat. I have another question. So you had said earlier when you were thinking about how to come up with story ideas as a motivation for coming up with things that are compelling and that other people might find interesting. It occurred to me, especially in my work, that sometimes the story just isn't interesting, but I have to tell it, right?
Yeah.
Or I have to make somebody else care about it. I have to make my boss care that
Mm.
XYZ is happening. So, do you have any tips on that? Do you have any? Has that happened, or maybe you can reflect on any experience you've had with that? And did you have any tips?
Yes. So that does happen. For us, so I should have mentioned this. So the pudding is our editorial branch, but we also have a client branch where we work with people who come to us and they're like, we have this really cool data and we would like to pay you to tell a story about it. And the fact that they pay us to tell stories about their stuff means that we can create things on the pudding. It basically is funding our pudding editorial work. And what that means is that nobody's telling us what to put on the pudding. So the pudding itself, the content you see there is all stuff we actually really did want to do. And if there's anything that we didn't want to do, it doesn't end up on the pudding. We like trash it. Um, but that being said, there have definitely been times in the client world where, sometimes there's just like, the story isn't that interesting. And I find myself like sometimes falling into that trap where I'm like, ugh, this is boring. But they they really want to tell this story. And so I kind of like just do my best to think about how can I make it slightly more interesting? Like how can I either present this in a way that draws the reader in or convince the reader that this is something interesting. So and I think some of that just like you have to be interested in it and if you're not like trying to make yourself interested in it or like finding the things that at least get you like a little bit interested helps at least for me to like shape it into something that other people would find interesting too. And sometimes that's just a matter of like reorganizing how the data is presented, or sometimes we just like use something a little flashier because it draws people in and then you can be like, this was cool. Okay, also let's talk about this other thing that maybe you don't find super interesting, but is really important and you need to know about. Um, yeah, so I think just finding ways that you find it interesting and trying to bring other people along as well, like communicating your excitement to them as best as possible. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Definitely does.
it,
Thank you.
yeah, definitely. It is definitely a challenge. And
So I think
definitely,
about things that are important, like, you know, redistricting, you know, like,
Hmm.
like that's super important and people will really need to care about it, but then
Yeah,
you try to make people care about things. So that's a hard problem. But
yeah.
thanks for the advice.
Sometimes with stuff like, oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. That was it.
Oh no. Sometimes with things like redistricting, if you make it applicable to the reader as best you can, like at the beginning, that's sometimes a way to pull them in. So, like, if you can geolocate them and be like, this is your district. Let's look at how your district has been changed over the past X number of years. Like, if you can kind of like make it as personalized as possible to a reader at the beginning, sometimes that's a good way to hook them and be like, well, I do live in that district and I don't think my district has changed, has it? Whoa, it has or it hasn't, but all of these other ones have. Who's
Mm-hmm.
affected by that? Like
Yep.
that is sometimes a way to pull people in. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard though. With things like that, it is so hard. We we sometimes, and this is not always the case, but sometimes we talk about topics people might not have necessarily been venturing to read about, um, by also talking about something that they might find more interesting. So that was a really cryptic way of putting that. I think of it as kind of like, I don't know if you've ever had a pet or a child, but with like my dog, if I need to give him medicine, I might wrap it in cheese because the cheese is better than the medicine, right? And so sometimes if we want to talk about something serious that people might not want to read about, we will talk about something else instead. So like my colleague Matt wrote a story about emo rap, which is a genre of rap that is like has very emotional lyrics. And he like wrote this whole thing where he was like comparing it to like OG emo music like Dashboard Confessional, and it was meant to be kind of like silly and it had a lot of like emojis with like emo hair and stuff, but he used that as a vehicle to talk about like toxic masculinity, which is like you wouldn't get as many people to click on an article being like, let's talk about toxic masculinity. But if you're like, let's talk about emo rap and Dashboard Confessional and compare them, then it's like, also, toxic masculinity is a reason that emo is even a genre. Like, you can kind of sneak in that information,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. It doesn't always work, but sometimes that is something that can be done
Yeah.
as well.
Great idea. Cool. I have to look for that. That sounds like a, a fun article to read.
Oh yeah, it's I love
Um,
the piece. It's fabulous.
and we've got another question in the chat. Do you have advice on breaking complex data down visually, creating self-containing visuals?
Hmm. Can you give a little more context on what you mean by like self-containing visuals?
And you can unmute yourself, Stella, if you like.
Yes. So my idea is, or my question is, if you deliver it to a client and they forward a PowerPoint or or export it somewhere, and that it's self-explanatory afterwards, and without anyone walking them through it.
Mm, got it. Okay. So you're saying that it might be taken out of the context with which you shared it?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So that is something we worry about sometimes because people can screenshot our stuff and then share it without any context. So I mean, there's only so much you can do, like really, because people are going to do what they're going to do. But we try to get around that as much as possible by making sure that our charts have titles, that wherever possible, there's a source like right up against the chart. Basically so that like if you're going to take a screenshot, you're probably going to also include this context, and it would be a pain to not include the context. So like whatever you can do to make it so that it would be like more work for them to go and like awkwardly crop out the title than to just take a screenshot that includes the title. um, I've found that kind of helps because people are more likely to then just like screenshot the whole thing. And so I think if you're like having a PowerPoint that is from a client that might then get passed, make sure your slides have context on them. So I don't know if they're passing it as a slide because you could add speaker notes potentially, but if you're like, if they might print it or something, yeah, I would suggest doing as much as possible to like make sure there's a title, add a caption maybe. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of what else you could include. Does this happen a lot where people are like going like it gets really far away from you and they don't know like a lot of pertinent information?
Yes, that's the main issue.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing I can think of would be to include as much information as you can. I mean, you could do some, I don't know what type of work you're doing, but you know, we have the luxury of having a lot of stuff that's public and or on a website. And so like you could include like a web address that's like, for more information, like go to this link. And so even if somebody's like got the screenshot or whatever, they can go to that link for more information so that at least where to find more info is still moving along with it. But if you can't make it public or you can't put it on a link, yeah, that's a lot more complicated. I guess you could put contact info to make sure they know who to contact if they have questions in case it gets really far.
That's a good idea. Yes, it helps.
Okay, good.
Any other last minute questions for Amber? While we're waiting for the, have you found learning or using D3? How have you found learning or using a D3 from an R background?
So D3 was a big learning curve for me. No, that's okay. It's a good question. So for me, I started learning D3 when I wanted to make a visual that I couldn't figure out how to make in R. And at that point, I was really so excited about creating the visual that I don't think I paid too much attention to how frustrated I was. So my first project I made in D3, I understood maybe like 30% of the code, and a lot of it came from like tutorials and videos and things like that. And so I didn't really fully understand it. But after that, I realized that it was a pretty powerful tool. I wanted to learn more. But I had no background in JavaScript at all. And D3 is just a very different programming language, or JavaScript is, sorry. And yeah, it definitely has taken me a while to get the hang of it. And I even now like flip back and forth between JavaScript and R a lot and find myself like using equals instead of the arrow, or using like I will go to define a variable in R using like the JavaScript preface for defining a variable or something. And I'm like, this is a pain. But I mean, that comes down to just like a little bit of back and forth. But as far as like actually learning it, it's a steep learning curve. But I think having a little bit of a background in R definitely helped me. That like I was a little bit better off than if I had no programming knowledge. So if you're an R user, you can do it. I mean, even if you're not an R user, like you can definitely learn D3 just by like sheer power of will and using, you know, the resources on the internet. But yeah, I do usually like to be upfront with people that it was not easy. But if you're interested in this space, highly recommend. And there's a lot of people who are willing to like help answer questions and stuff like that. So definitely don't be afraid to ask questions if you have them.
Excellent, excellent. Looks like that was the last question. And you got a big thank you. Lots of great feedback in the chat too. People seem to be really engaged. So yeah, definitely wanted to just take another opportunity to thank you for joining us in the middle of your workday. It seems like I know you're on the West Coast. Yeah, this was really interesting. I learned a lot. Do you have slides that you can share with our attendees?
Okay. Yeah, totally. Okay. I can
Okay.
send you the deck. Apologies that it's a little bit of a mess, but yes, I can send it to you.
It's real. It's real world. So
yeah.
we'll learn from that. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So and I also put Amber's Twitter information up on our meetup page. So if you'd like to follow her or reach out to her for more information about different things, I'm sure she'd be happy to engage with you. But yeah, this has been great. So definitely want to thank you for being here and giving us such a great talk.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's it, right, everyone? So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this session. Hope you learned something. And yeah, I hope you come back and join us again for another edition of Our Ladies Dallas. So with that, take care and have a good evening.